So this is the first lecture on the pancreas. In this video we're going to look at some of the general anatomy and physiology of the pancreas, focus more on the exocrine pancreas. The next video we'll look at the endocrine pancreas and insulin, and then we'll look at some pancreatic disorders in the subsequent videos. So unlike a lot of the other digestive organs, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, the pancreas is retroperitoneal, so it's behind the peritoneal cavity. That's similar to the kidney system as well, of course. It's about 6 inches long, it's posterior to the greater curvature of the stomach, and it's connected to the duodenum by 2 ducts. And we'll look at those ducts here in just a moment. But basically, the region of the pancreas known as the head of the pancreas, kind of nestles in the loop of the duodenum. Then the tail of the pancreas kind of projects this way. And then, of course, the spleen, which is not physically connected, but kind of butts right up against the tail, is found here. And then the body is the part in between. The pancreatic ducts are the primary pancreatic duct, which is going to carry all of the pancreatic juice and the secretions into the duodenum. And then this is where it joins actually the common hepatic duct. So the whole biliary system comes in here. Of course, the common hepatic duct, the common bile duct, is joining the common hepatic duct, which goes up into the liver. And then there's a cystic duct, which goes off into the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is kind of an appendage on the side of that duct system. And then there is a little ampulla here called the ampulla of Vater, or the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And there's a little sphincter, the sphincter of Oddi. And this is located about a third of the way down the duodenum. And this is an important landmark for example, endoscopy, doing EGD. The scope comes down the duodenum, and they can actually examine the ampulla and the sphincter. The pancreas, in terms of functions, really is a double-fold organ. It has an exocrine part. Remember, exocrine organs are secreting to a mucosal surface, and the exocrine pancreas consists of what are called acinar cells, and they secrete the pancreatic juice. Pancreas produces about 1,200 to 1,500 milliliters of pancreatic juice a day, and it's secreted into the duct, which then goes into the duodenum. And that juice contains, number one, bicarbonate, which is important. That is going to, actually, that should be HCO3. That is going to neutralize stomach acid, and that will help prevent the stomach acid actually from damaging the duodenum, which doesn't have the same kind of mucosal protection that the stomach has. It's also important because the digestive enzymes that are released by the pancreas, they're released in a form known as zymogens, which are inactive. And then when they reach the alkaline pH of the duodenum, because of the pancreatic juice, they become active. And so they need that right pH to function. Of course, if these enzymes were active within the pancreas, they'd begin to auto-digest the pancreas, and that can happen, of course, in acute pancreatitis, acute or chronic pancreatitis. Pancreatic amylase, this of course is the main enzyme needed for carbohydrate digestion, the proteases for protein digestion, and the lipase is what begins to cleave off free fatty acids from triglycerides. And there are also DNA RNases, which are breaking down DNA and RNA that we eat in the diet. So that's the exocrine pancreas. The endocrine pancreas is secreting, of course, directly into the blood, and that consists of the islets of Langerhans. So these are small collections of cells that are scattered throughout the pancreas. They're connected not to the pancreatic duct, but to the capillaries that go through the pancreas. And the primary secretion, of course, is insulin, and that is secreted by beta cells. Beta cells also secrete amylin, and we'll look at those functions later. Insulin is one of your primary anabolic hormones in the body. In short, it basically increases glucose uptake by muscle and adipose tissue, and it's going to essentially promote storage of fats. It's going to promote storage of glycogen and so forth, and its overall role is to decrease plasma glucose. Glucagon is secreted by alpha cells. This is a more catabolic hormone working opposite of insulin. So it's decreasing glucose uptake by muscle and adipose. increasing the breakdown of glycogen and stimulating gluconeogenesis, which, as you remember, is the production of glucose from substrates such as amino acids, lactate, and the glycerol and triglycerides. And that is going to increase blood glucose. And then somatostatin is secreted by delta cells and the D cells, and these cells actually downregulate insulin and glucagon secretion. Somatostatin is one of those neurotransmitters we see throughout the endocrine system. Technically, it's a peptide hormone. It basically works as a brake to downregulate any secretion. So in this case, it's going to decrease both insulin and glucagon secretion. There's also something called pancreatic polypeptide, PPY, secreted by so-called F cells, and then ghrelin. Ghrelin is secreted by epsilon cells. The ghrelin is actually your hunger hormone. So when ghrelin is secreted, that stimulates the desire to eat. So the stomach also secretes ghrelin, and that's where, between meals, when the stomach empties, you get that kind of gurgling sound, but that stimulates your appetite. So those are some of the endocrine secretions, which we'll look at in more detail. Here's just another image of the pancreatic cells and tissues. So you can see clearly the pancreatic duct here, and that's the pathway. So here are the acinar cells. They're basically like any sort of mucosal secreting gland. They're lined in epithelium. They make the enzymes in the zymogen form. That's going to go out through the pancreatic duct. Now, there is an accessory duct. It's not shown here, and I'll talk about that later. So there's actually a second duct that also empties into the duodenum, and that forms because actually the pancreas embryologically forms as two little outpouchings from the gut tube on either side, and each little side has its own duct. And as the pancreas forms, these two sides are going to merge together and fuse, and that's going to create the second duct there. But we'll come back to that one. And then scattered throughout, you see the islets of Langerhans, and they are secreting the insulin that's going directly into the blood system. Now, notice this is actually showing the arterial blood. So this is the splenic artery, which is coming off the celiac trunk. This is the aorta here. And the venous system is where all this is going to drain into. So this picture is not quite correct. It actually should be the splenic vein. And that is going to actually drain into the portal vein. So the interesting thing is that all of the endocrine secretions from the pancreas drain directly into the portal vein. And so the liver will be exposed to these hormones first. Now we'll look at the effects of insulin in the liver. It's not going to be the same as in skeletal muscle and in adipose, but it's going to definitely have an anabolic role in the liver. So that's the two aspects, the endocrine and the exocrine secreting aspects of the pancreas. In terms of external anatomy, the branches of the arteries that feed the pancreas really come from two areas. One is the celiac artery, which is up here, again coming off the aorta. It's really in this area of the epigastrum, we used to call it the solar plexus. Now what's important about this is that, interesting, as we look at the nerves, especially sympathetic nerves, they're going to actually follow the arteries into the different organs here. The body of the pancreas and the tail, so these two regions, the tail by the spleen and the middle part, the body, is supplied by branches of the splenic artery. And then the head and inferior, the head region actually is going to be supplied by two regions. One is actually going to come off the superior mesenteric artery. So remember, the superior mesenteric artery feeds most of the small intestine. This is generally not that significant clinically, although, there's an interesting phenomena more in traditional medicines, this idea that organs become hypoperfused, not to the point of ischemia or infarction, but that it affects the function of that organ. For example, Chinese medicine, they talk about the yang aspect of an organ, that is the metabolism, and that is directly connected to the arterial blood and the oxygenation of that organ. So this would be the yang aspect of the perfusion of oxygen into the organ. A lot of the herbs that stimulate the pancreas, for example, a lot of digestive bitters, one theory is that they actually increase circulation through the celiac and the superior mesenteric plexus. So they actually vasodilate, and they allow more oxygen into the organ, and that assists the organ in doing all of its different functions. Again, notice the spleen itself is not directly connected to the pancreas. A lot of people, I still hear that they think there's connections there. The spleen and the pancreas share the same blood supply from both the splenic artery off the celiac trunk here, and then they drain into the portal vein, both of them. But the spleen we can think of as sort of a giant lymph node stuck into the blood. So biomedically it has no direct connection with digestion, but I will come back to that because immunologically we do think the spleen is very much involved in sort of the final step in determining how the immune system responds to dietary antigens. So when we have a lot of food sensitivities and these sorts of things, we do think the spleen is involved in the programming of the T cells there. The venous system, the body and the neck of the pancreas drain into the splenic vein, and the head drains into the superior mesenteric vein. Both of these drain into the portal vein, again going straight to the liver. And then there are lymphatics that drain into the pancreosplenic lymph nodes. That converges into the cisterna chyli in the mediastinum in the chest, and then that drains into the thoracic duct into the left subclavian vein. So this would be significant, of course, in the lymphatics. In the case of cancers, pancreatic adenocarcinoma could spread through those regional lymph nodes. Now, interestingly, again, from a more traditional angle, the veins and the lymphatics, we can say, drain away blood. If there is any congestion of blood, we'd say that might be a state of heat. These would be cooling. So we can think of this as more of a yin cooling aspect of the organ function. But then very importantly, the nerves. We usually don't think of the pancreas and the connection with the nervous system, but the autonomics have two branches, of course, that go into the pancreas. We have the parasympathetic from the vagus nerve, and what the vagus stimulation effectively does through acetylcholine, which is its neurotransmitter, it's going to increase the secretion of pancreatic juice as well as the secretion of insulin and decrease glucagon. The sympathetic nerves, which arise from the thoracic spinal segments, and they actually converge into a bundle of nerves around the celiac trunk right in front of the aorta. That's called the celiac plexus. When that is active, and of course the main neurotransmitter of the sympathetics is norepinephrine, when norepinephrine fires and hits the acinar cells as well as the islets of Langerhans, it's going to effectively decrease the secretion of pancreatic juice, decrease insulin, and will increase glucagon. And so when you have hypoglycemia, the sympathetics will fire, and one of the effects is to increase glucagon from the pancreas, and that will increase your blood sugar through all the different things that glucagon does. So this is interesting that we're realizing that the pancreas is very importantly controlled by the autonomics. Now I'll come back to this theme because interestingly we have a lot of techniques in integrative medicine, for example acupuncture. A lot of good data suggesting acupuncture is actually a direct way of communicating with the parasympathetic nervous system, or the autonomics in general, sympathetic and parasympathetic. When we needle, for example, along what is known as the stomach channel, that it seems to increase the vagal tone to the stomach and the pancreas. In fact, the stomach and pancreas, from the perspective of the autonomics, we can think of as paired organs. Both actually need adequate vagal stimulation. In the case of the stomach, the vagus nerve, of course, increases stomach acid via stimulating parietal cells. And in the pancreas, it's going to increase the insulin, but also the pancreatic juice. Now, of course, there are other hormones we'll talk about. So a big one being secretin. Secretin is going to be secreted by duodenal epithelium. There are enteroendocrine cells there, and they secrete secretin, which will also stimulate the pancreas to release the pancreatic juice. And then the final hormone that's also released by duodenal cells, so secretin is one of them, is going to be cholecystokinin, CCK. So basically secretin, cholecystokinin, and acetylcholine, which comes from the vagus nerve, all of these are going to effectively turn on the pancreas versus norepinephrine from your sympathetic nervous system is going to work effectively to inhibit the pancreatic activity. So both the neuroendocrine system plays a significant role here in regulating pancreatic function. So I mentioned embryologically the pancreas actually forms from the gut tube, which is endoderm. So remember, endoderm really gives rise to all of the epithelium in your GI organs. It also forms the liver, and in this case, the pancreas. So when this happens in the fifth week of embryological development, you find that there's little buds that grow off the gut tube. And they're actually on either side. So one is a dorsal bud here, and that's going to grow. And then another one is the ventral bud that's here. And then off the ventral bud is another bud for the gallbladder and then for the liver. So the liver gallbladder will develop from this, and the ventral bud will actually merge around and merge with the dorsal bud. And so again, each one has its own duct, and that's why we see a primary and accessory duct going into the duodenum in the pancreas. So it really requires a fusion of those two. Now, insulin and glucagon can be detected in the human fetal circulation by about the 4th and 5th month of development. So we could say the pancreas comes online at that point. Of course, it's not secreting any digestive enzymes at that point because the fetus is not eating. It's through the digestive system, but that will, of course, come on after birth. Interestingly, it does take several months. In fact, I've seen really up to 7 years for that pancreatic function to really stabilize. And it's interesting to think that a lot of the immune issues we see, eczema and those kinds of things in babies can be related actually to pancreatic insufficiency. I'll come back to that, but that's one we can really support with a lot of the integrative therapeutics. Now, various congenital anomalies can occur because of this merging process that has to happen in the pancreatic buds. This can result ultimately in inadequate draining of the exocrine pancreas, and that can lead to pancreatitis, especially chronic pancreatitis. So one malformation here would be what's called an annular pancreas, and that's where the head of the pancreas encircles the duodenum. So they merged around, but it kind of wrapped around the duodenum instead, and that's going to create a stricture in the duodenum and obstruction. And that occurs fairly rarely, about 1 in every 12 to 15,000 newborns. If it's minor, it's going to be asymptomatic. If it's symptomatic, we might think things like polyhydramnios, which is the excess of amniotic fluid, and low birth weight. And then immediately after birth, of course, feeding intolerance because no food would be able to get down into the duodenum. Unfortunately, most of those symptomatic cases will need a surgical correction to heal that. Another is called Pancreas Divisum, and that's where the ducts of the pancreas fail to fuse properly. And so we get two distinct dorsal and ventral ducts, and that's going to occur in about 10% of all embryos. Usually that's asymptomatic, but that can really lead to chronic pancreatitis, and surgery again could be an option there. And then finally, ectopic pancreas is a pancreas. It's normal in structure, but it grows in an abnormal place. So it can grow in the submucosa of the stomach or the bowel. And that rarely causes problems because the ducts are still complete and it still secretes the enzymes and so forth. So these are just a few congenital anomalies to be familiar with regarding the pancreas. So lastly here, let's look at the exocrine pancreas in more detail. So the pancreas produces, again, about 1,200 to 1,500 milliliters of pancreatic juice a day. It contains mostly water, some electrolytes, salts, potassium, sodium, and so forth. Sodium bicarbonate, of course, which is going to make the pancreatic juice slightly alkaline, around pH between 7 and 8. It's going to buffer the stomach acid in the chyme. So remember that as the food leaves the stomach, it's chyme at that point, and that's going to be, of course, saturated in stomach acid. It's going to stop also the action of pepsin. So remember, pepsin is one of your proteolytic enzymes in the stomach, so it's going inactivate pepsin when it reaches the duodenum. And it's going to create the proper pH for those zymogens to become activated. So I've already mentioned the different enzymes, but again, that would be pancreatic amylase. Trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, elastase would be your proteases, pancreatic lipase, and then ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease would be digesting the nucleic acids. Now these exocrine cells, of course, are forming little ducts, and they secrete their secretions right into the main pancreatic duct. You know, going back to what actually stimulates the secretion, this is important because, again, we need the parasympathetic nervous system. That's part of the gastric, both the cephalic and the gastric phase of digestion. Remember, cephalic is when the food reaches your mouth, you start to salivate. That's going to stimulate the vagus nerve to start the secretion of stomach acid and stimulates peristalsis in the stomach. But then when the food reaches the stomach and there's increased pressure in the stomach wall, that's also going to stimulate the parasympathetics, and that will activate the pancreas. So the food hitting the stomach is one of the signals to get the pancreas activated. Secretin is released by those duodenal cells again, and that's going to, in response to acidic chyme hitting them, and that's going to trigger the pancreas to secrete their digestive enzymes, specifically bicarbonate. And then cholecystokinin, that's going to be secreting when protein, but more specifically fat, reaches the duodenal wall, and that's going to enter the portal system. It's going to get to the pancreas, and it's going to stimulate digestive enzyme secretion. Again, if you look at the concentrations of these hormones in the blood, they're extremely small. So I can't remember specifically, but it's more than 10 to the minus 6 dilution. I think it's even to the 10 to the minus 9th dilution, and maybe even more. So very, very tiny signals are able to stimulate the pancreas to secrete. You can imagine if you're under a lot of stress, you're in a constant sympathetic state, that's going to definitely compromise the parasympathetic nervous system. So that would then downregulate the digestive secretions. Now let's say you have a very protein-rich meal, and those proteases will not be sufficient. Remember that in terms of protein digestion, only about 20% of protein digestion actually occurs in the stomach. So your pepsin and acid start the process, but 80% of that protein digestion occurs in the duodenum and the jejunum under the action of the pancreatic proteases. So you need good amounts of those digestive enzymes. But chronic stress will decrease that. You maybe won't break down those peptides, and now two things can happen. One is intestinal bacteria will take over that job for you, and especially in the large intestine, a lot of those proteins, especially from tryptophan, if they're tryptophan rich, will produce things like indoles and scatols and a lot of potentially toxic and even potentially carcinogenic compounds, which then are absorbed. And the liver has to basically take care of that, has to detox all of that. And that's what the older naturopaths used to actually call auto-intoxication. And that's why they would recommend low-protein diets. Today, with keto and everything, everyone seems to have gone the other way. But that's important that we have adequate enzymes to actually break those peptides down. The other thing that can happen is the peptides can actually cause, the bacteria ferment them. It causes local inflammation, and that can actually damage the tight junctions between the enterocytes and the small intestine, and then the peptides actually leak in between the enterocytes right into the blood, and they could potentially then form antigens. And then your immune system reacts against them, and then we start seeing inflammations in other parts of the body, the joints and the sinuses and places like that. So that could be another reason, and that's why stimulating the pancreas is sort of a key to really targeting a lot of systemic illness, because a lot of people seem to have pancreatic insufficiency. And we'll get into the different things that can do that, but a lot of the herbal therapies that are bitters, apple cider vinegar, these different things actually can activate the pancreatic activity, and that's going to help you break those foods down better and decrease the overall inflammation in the body. Okay, so that's a little intro to the pancreas and the exocrine pancreas. In the next video, we'll look at the endocrine pancreas, insulin, and glucagon in more depth.